Hello, everybody. Welcome to another conversation streamed live on Facebook Live on the South West Surrey constituency Labour Party Facebook page. My name is Toby Westcott White, and I hosted last week's conversation, which was with Councillor Nick Palmer. That was a good conversation about everything coronavirus related and how Waverley Borough Council was trying to resolve or trying to help with the issue at hand, but we did also speak about the Labour leadership results as they had just come out a few days before. We thought we'd try something slightly different this time. So today we've asked Adrian La Porta, who is a member of the South West Surrey Labour Party. He stood in the Surrey County Council by-election last year in Haslemere. Adrian's day job is well, hopefully we'll ask him in a minute what it is, because he can explain it in sort of layman's terms. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring Adrian in so that hopefully he can come in and explain it. Hello, Adrian.
Hello, Toby.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you.
Good. So just briefly, if you could explain maybe in sort of simpler layman's terms, because I know that you've explained it to me a couple of times. I think I understand what it is, but if you can explain what it is, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Toby. Before I do that, I just wanted to echo the message that Nick sent last week. That our first thoughts have to be with those who've maybe lost loved ones in this pandemic, and that those people who may be suffering at the moment in hospital, and send our best wishes to all those in the front line in the NHS and the other support services. Yeah. So coming back to your question, I'm a chemical engineer, actually a biochemical engineer. Okay. So I'm a chartered engineer, and basically that means that I design processes and factories that make medicines, including vaccines.
So there you go. So that's quite crucially important this time. So I guess you've been pretty busy in the past few months.
Yeah, it's a very strange time because some of the longer term projects are obviously being put on hold. A lot of people, businesses are being disrupted at the same time. We're trying to do what we can to meet the immediate needs of the crisis. So I guess what I wanted to do was to share what I know about the current situation from a professional point of view, because I think it's important that we're all as well informed as we possibly can be, and also because I think that there's quite a lot of optimistic news coming out of the pharmaceutical industry and out of research and development. So a lot of us are wondering, what comes next, and hopefully there's some positive news to come out of what I'm going to talk about today.
Brilliant. Just to make it clear as well, hoping that we can, if we get any comments from any of the viewers on Facebook Live, they can just do that, and then I can show them up, and maybe we can have a go at answering them. The best
yeah.
Say that again, sorry.
We will certainly try with those as they come in. So I've been really heartened and impressed by the overall response of industry to the emergency. So in my sector, the pharmaceutical industry, in the construction industry, because I kind of work in both, in the wider medical technology and hospital supply industry, everybody seems very willing to help. A lot of companies you will have seen in the press are offering a lot of help on a free basis, on a pro bono basis. Okay. And you may have heard people like Rolls-Royce and Dyson, big British corporate players who aren't even in these sectors have been offering their help. So that's that's very encouraging. In fact, one of the issues that we've seen in the voluntary group that I've been working with is there are far more offers of help than the people in central government and the NHS can actually deal with. So what we see is lots of people offering help, offering services, offering products, but of course the people at the sharp end, whether that's in government, national government, local government, or in the NHS, are already in some sort of overload situation. So what we're all trying to do is to respond to specific requests when they come out from government or the NHS, but also try and think ahead and try and work out what might be needed. And it's quite tricky, because you might end up doing something which is not going to be useful, but we kind of figure that it's better to have a go at doing something useful on the hope that it will be, rather than sit back and wait for requests. So I guess that applies across a lot of industry in general, but certainly in the more technical end of things, that's what we see. So if anybody listening is involved with the front line, as it were, within the NHS at a regional level, and they know of things which they think the engineering community could possibly help with, then we'd be very interested to hear about that. I can actually give an example of that. So we got in touch with our colleagues in Ireland, because there's a very big pharmaceutical industry in Ireland, and they're a little ahead of us. And when they started seeing how they could offer help, one of the first things that came up was the fact that the oxygen supply systems, which are built into hospitals, were inadequate for this kind of emergency. So generally speaking, you expect a few people to be on ventilators, not the vast numbers that are going into hospitals at the moment. So they were able to help in something you would not have thought of off the top of your head in looking at these things. Other areas that people are looking at are areas like building temporary hospitals and isolation wards, supplying hand sanitizer. So these are things which are not the subject of what I was going to talk about today, but they're just examples of how the engineering and science community can help with things. So if there's something you think you need help with, then get in touch, and we'll see if we can find the right people to help, because as I say, there's lots of people out there trying to do what they can.
Brilliant. So I think you touched on this briefly, but about what you can help with the government in the future. And I've sort of read into that maybe that the government aren't really too sure what they do need in the future. Is that correct?
Well, it's difficult to know, because I think what we can see is there's a lot of short-term action, and the sort of things that we deal with, which is building, say, factories to manufacture vaccines, manufacture drugs, are not the short-term, the very short-term things. But this crisis is not going to be over in a few weeks, unfortunately. And as I'll come on to in a minute, we're going to be looking at this carrying on for well into 2021, and nobody really knows how it's going to pan out. So we've got short-term issues, and clearly, in a crisis, the authorities, government, and the NHS have to treat the most urgent things first, but at the same time, you hope that there are people planning for the medium and long-term requirements. I should say, before I go any further, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and I'm not many things. I'm certainly not a doctor. I'm a chemical engineer, and I'm just really giving you my view based on what I've seen with the industry. But the volunteer group I work with does include quite a lot of the people that are pretty experienced in building vaccines and drug manufacturing technology and plant around the world. So we have that group certainly has quite a lot of experience to draw on. So there's three areas really that we're looking at: vaccines, treatments or therapies, and testing or diagnostics. And they all have a different role to play in getting us out of the current situation. So if it's okay, I'll just talk about each of those in turn and ask questions as you
that sounds good,
as you feel appropriate. So we'll talk about vaccines, treatments, and testing, and they kind of work in different time frames. So the thing that we're all wondering is how and when things can get back to some sort of normality. There's a whole range of reasons why we might think that the world is never going to be quite the same as it was before this, but the key in getting it as close to back to normal will be the ability to vaccinate people against this virus. So the vaccines are the key to some kind of return to normality, because what they effectively allow us to do is to allow everybody to be exposed to the virus without falling ill. There's no way we can remove the virus from the environment. It's there, just like flu or the common cold. So what the vaccine, an effective vaccine, will do is allow us to come into contact with it and not become severely ill. There's over 100 different potential vaccines in development at the moment. So
that's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, and they range from the biggest vaccine manufacturers in the world. So you may have heard of GlaxoSmithKline, it's a British-based company, and Sanofi Pasteur, which is a big French company. They're two of the biggest vaccine producers in the world, and they've now teamed up together to produce their vaccine candidates. Pfizer, who are the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world, are a US company. They're working on something with a small biotech company. But there's a whole range of large and small companies and research institutes. All the top universities, all the top medical schools are all working on this. So there's a lot of vaccines in development all over the world. So that's good. The science, however, is complex, and developers can't be sure that the vaccines will work until they've been tested. So it normally takes 10 to 15 years to develop a new vaccine. I think I saw one of the fastest ones developed to date was the Ebola vaccine, and that took about 5 years. People are talking about, I talked about GlaxoSmithKline and Sanofi Pasteur, and I say if anybody knows this area, they're talking about getting a vaccine available for Q3 next year. So if you think that the key to getting back to normal is having a vaccine, and that vaccine may not be available for another year, we've got a bit of a long haul on here. Which is where some of the other things may come in to help. I would say that I think I mentioned Pfizer. They're talking about having something ready for Christmas, and you may see in the press that people are talking about having vaccines available in the next few months. I understand that what they mean is that some vaccines could be available for instance, frontline workers in a much shorter period of time. So part of the reasoning behind this is that once you've worked out what your vaccine is going to be, and there's lots of different technologies, and I should say a lot of these are heavily dependent on biotechnology. So if you heard of biotechnology and you thought it was a scary thing, then biotechnology is coming to the rescue. So Um, yeah, most of these are biotech based products. But once you've actually discovering the initial compounds, molecules, whatever, it has been quite rapid. The thing is, we're going to inject these into the general population, including children, ill people. So having the safety testing is absolutely critical, and that, I think, is probably the longest part of the process. So once you've done your initial discovery, it's doing what they call clinical trials. You've probably heard of the term. So doing clinical trials is the thing that takes the time, and none of us want that to be done in a way that's going to endanger people from the vaccine instead of the disease. That's some of these clinical trials have already started. So you may have seen in the press the Oxford group, which is one of the leading contenders, have already started clinical trials. Yeah, I was talking about the timing. So we may be able to see some of these things being used in sort of specific applications for health workers, or perhaps where people are at very high risk, and it's better to give them an untested vaccine than not. You know, these are finely tuned decisions for which there are very well established clinical guidelines and ethical guidelines. So what's happening is that the regulators, the people who police these guidelines, are adjusting their norms in response to the pandemic. So it's trying to work out what the best overall outcome for everybody is. So we're probably looking at sometime next year before a vaccine is going to be widely available, and that's the most important thing in terms of us putting this behind us and we can go back to some form of normality. But once a vaccine or multiple vaccines are shown to be safe and effective, we do have to be able to make enough doses for the tens of millions of people in the UK that need them, and potentially billions of people worldwide. And there's obviously, there are some countries that are financially and technologically better able to produce vaccines than others. Another concern is, how do we manufacture enough material for us in the UK? How do we manufacture for people around the world, and particularly in the developing world? So there are people looking at this. There is an organisation that was set up by the Wellcome Foundation and the Gates Foundation called CEPI, and they've been preparing for this in a way that most national governments haven't. So they are looking at, they've got a number of technologies and candidate vaccines in the pipeline, which could be deployed globally. But as I say, at the moment, the how we produce enough for everybody is a bit of an open question. And of course, if we get, hopefully, we won't get the situation we've seen with some of the critical supplies where countries are kind of squabbling over these things. We have to come to something fairly equitable in terms of supply. And the European Union has been quite good in developing Europe-wide distribution sort of agreements, which unfortunately the UK has not been part of to date. So that's the vaccination picture.
Okay.
So what happens, before these vaccines are available? Until mass vaccination occurs, there's obviously a danger of new increases in infections, and I don't think anybody thinks that we can carry on with the current lockdown, as it is for another 18 months. It'd just be economically impossible. But what's happening in parallel is the development of lots of drug treatments, which can reduce the effects of the disease, possibly down to very minimal effects. So in the same way there's hundreds of vaccines in development, there are hundreds of therapies in development. There's nearly 100 different treatments in clinical trials right now. Because it takes a long time to do clinical trials for new drugs, in the same way it takes a long time to do clinical trials for new vaccines, what the various companies and research institutes have been doing is looking at a wide range of existing drugs, and from their understanding about how they work against different viruses, they put a lot of these into clinical trials, and some of these clinical trials are due to finish fairly soon. So the one that's probably got the most press is the hydrochloroquine drug that Donald Trump likes, and a bad drug. I should say it might be pretty useful, and the clinical trials on that are coming through. But that is only one out of many different types of drug which are being tested. So the good thing about that, as I say, is it's going to come on stream a lot quicker than the vaccine. And what these treatments could do is to reduce the severity of symptoms, reduce the mortality rate, reduce the pressure on intensive care units and on hospitals in general, because most of us, given the choice of having an injection or taking a pill or having surgery and going into intensive care, clearly the pharmaceutical route is generally much more cost effective in terms of medical resources. So the other thing is some of these things could be given to medical workers, people in the front line, as prophylactics to help keep them safe. And so there's a really wide range of these what they call repurposed drugs which are being tested at the moment. So hopefully more than one of these will come into the clinic pretty quickly. As well as the repurposed drugs, there's also very many new drugs being developed on a therapeutic basis as opposed to a vaccination basis. So really you get to see the full power, if you like, of the global pharmaceutical research community coming to bear on this. It's quite impressive, and many of these drugs will fail, many of them won't work, but there is a lot being thrown at it. So that's, if you like, the second pillar after vaccines. It's the therapeutics, the treatments, and finally, and these are kind of a reverse order of how quickly they can have an effect. Is testing, which is probably the most controversial part in the UK at the moment. So coming from the chemical engineering point of view, chemical engineers are more involved in making the reagents, the chemicals which go into the tests, rather than actually making the test kits themselves. But the engineering community in general, makes the whole supply chain. So there's probably a lot more knowledge around about this area, but there's basically two broad areas of testing. There's a test called the real-time PCR test, which basically detects if you have the virus in your body or in the swab sample that's taken from you, and that's what's being set up. That's a very well established test. The science is very good, but there are quite a few shortages in the supply chain. So the government's setting up 3 national hubs, which are due to come on stream any day in terms of testing hubs. But there are concerns around the ability to provide all the materials into those hubs. The supply chain there is quite a concern. That's something that we're trying to help with, but it's quite complicated. So as you trace the supply chain further back up, you can be surprised as to what the thing is that runs out first. So the second class of test is an antibody test. So the problem with the first test, it tells you if you've got the virus, but if you've had the virus and basically your body's fought it off it won't tell you anything about that. So the antibody test, which I think there's controversy about the 350,000 failed tests or whatever it was that they bought, was an attempt to buy an antibody test. So the antibody test is trying to find out if you've had the disease and develop your own immunity to it, and that's important in understanding whether people can go back to work and can be safe. So that's all a bit hazy on the antibody test at the moment, but we're trying to find out more about that at the moment. The thing with the testing is it's not only important for protecting frontline workers, which is where the emphasis is correctly at the moment, but it's also an important part of having an exit strategy. So if you look at Germany and South Korea, they've done a lot better than we have so far, and what it opens up the possibility to do is to allow people back on the basis that you know that they've developed some sort of immunity, as opposed to the current situation where we're all locked up because nobody knows who's got it or who's had it. So with a good testing regime, we might be able to allow more people to go back to work, maybe on the basis of how important their jobs are, or what sort of risk group they they sit in. I did joke with my daughter that only the under 30s would be let out soon, so it could be controversial. So the testing approach not only needs the equipment and the reagents, the chemicals, all the plastic bits and bobs, and the people to test it, and the testing labs. It needs all of those things in a balanced supply chain.
Okay.
So those three areas which from a technology point of view could help us out. And to summarize, there's a huge amount of activity going on with lots of very impressive research institutes and companies doing their damnedest to get us out of this. And I would say that in general, we've seen a very high level of sort of philanthropic effort, and not a lot of profiteering or that sort of thing. So it's quite encouraging from that point of view. So a vaccine is what we need ultimately to get out of this. The treatments and the testing will help us have an exit strategy ahead of that. So I'd like to ask us any questions.
Okay, brilliant. That's really helpful. I feel like I understand everything when you see it in those three pillars, like you mentioned. The testing, and then what was the other one? The therapeutic side, is that right?
Yeah. So vaccines, treatments, testing.
Okay, brilliant. And they're all sort of like the weapons, basically, in this fight against the coronavirus, and how we're going to. And like you said, they're all different time lengths. How far away we can. Like you said, the vaccine 18 months, and like you said, 5 years for a vaccine. For Ebola being like the record, really does show, how quick we will have to move, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a huge effort.
One of the questions I was curious about, because I know that we keep hearing about South Korea and Germany being these really good examples of being able to essentially hunt. I think the people use the term "hunt down the virus" almost.
Yeah, so track and trace is another test. Track and trace is another terminology that people use.
Yeah, so that's big in Singapore as well, isn't it? They've done a lot of contact tracing in Singapore.
Successful.
Yeah, the thing is with that is obviously that's quite interesting. That in Singapore they've managed to do that, but we have to kind of realise that every single country is different. So like Singapore, they've got a bit more of the state's got a bit more of a stranglehold on the civic life there. So it's kind of maybe easier. I'm not sure. I appreciate that we're all in this situation now where I think people are willing to stay inside and do basically what the government and the police are telling them to do at this point. So I appreciate there may be a sort of new consensus. But in Germany, for example, Germany is the one that's quite interesting because it is quite similar in some ways to us, obviously quite a close neighbour. And they're obviously just testing at a rapid level. How are they able to do that if there's sort of a shortage of supply? Is it because they're part of this European procurement wide, or is it just luck? Did they act quicker than us?
Well, from what I've read, there's a number of factors at play here. One is they were very quick off the block in terms of getting testing in place. They were the first people to develop the test protocol for the whole world, and then they gave that to the World Health Organization, or the World Health Organization lab was actually in Germany for this area.
Okay.
Another factor is that they have a lot more laboratory capacity than we do, and I think Matt Hancock said the same thing in the last day or so, which and part of that is the federal structure of Germany. So they have far more distributed capacity. I suppose one of the UK's weaknesses as a state generally is it's over centralised. Another factor is that their GDP spending on health is quite a lot higher than the UK. So they another thing that we've been looking at is a statistic that a lot of people have been looking at is how many intensive care beds there are per head of population. The UK is lower than Italy, Spain, Germany, the US. So we're actually in quite a vulnerable position, and it's a testament really to the efforts of the NHS that the ICU intensive care capacity hasn't been overwhelmed, because we had a lot less to start with than most of the people. But coming back to the testing, we also had less testing capacity. There's also and this is speculation on my part, I'd have to say, but Germany and South Korea are two of the countries with the most heavy manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing bases in the world. So in a crisis, do you want look, in a crisis like this, is it better to have an industry based on science and technology, or a strong financial sector?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I've never actually thought about the two, like you said. It's just got obvious now that you say it, the two massive technological giants, in being South Korea and Germany.
But coincidence usually a bad explanation, isn't it? So.
Yeah.
But the Germans have done particularly well. But with all these things, with all these countries, you have to caveat it with so far as well.
Definitely. So you did mention Matt Hancock and testing. So we have got a question from Facebook. This is from one of the admins of the page, so I can't see quite who it is. But they thank you first, and they're very interesting. They said Matt Hancock committed to 100,000 tests a day by the end of the month. Do you think this is possible?
I suppose, to be fair, I don't really know. It seems, given that we got 2 weeks to go, if I had to put a bet on it, I'd say they probably won't make it. I know that the testing facilities are about to come on stream, these 3 hubs. And there's a company called Thermo Fisher Scientific who are supplying all of the tests. So they seem to be quite confident they can provide those. But I think just to get everything up and running smoothly, it seems quite a challenge. What I could add is that the German capacity was at 350,000, I think, per month. Now, I don't think they're doing a 350,000 per month at the moment, but they had that kind of level of capacity.
Wow, Well, that's something. I think we do have a couple other questions. There's another one here from the admin as well. We seem to have been both, especially unprepared and slow to respond. What's your view on that? Obviously, appreciate that, as you said, you're speaking from a personal capacity. So, do you sort of have any sort of thoughts on if we've been too slow to react to this? Especially as some people have seen that where it appears that we've almost had a head start, that we can see what was going on in Italy.
Yeah, I think there was there seemed to be a bit of confusion about the strategy at the start. There was this talk about going for herd immunity and this sort of thing. It seemed like a bit of a distraction, really. I'd also say that I think we seem to have the news that we're going to have enough ICU capacity is a great relief and a testament to all the efforts of everybody involved. So for instance, the armed forces have been quite heavily involved behind the scenes in building the Nightingale hospitals and that sort of thing. The territorials have been called up and that sort of thing. So I think typical of the British really is we started off badly and then done some heroic recovery. But on a more serious note, I think it's true that the government was warned about this, and in fact, to be fair, all governments are warned about this. And if there is a more general thing to learn, I would like to think that this crisis will make all governments take more notice of scientific advice. So I can think of at least two, and there's probably a lot more people and organisations were saying that we had to prepare for a pandemic, and I don't think that advice was taken on board by governments. And I just wish that government was a lot more fact and data driven rather than politics and opinion driven. The other thing I'd come back to is the that's my dog in the background. He agrees with me.
Yeah.
Is the fact that we spend less GDP on health in general is bound to make us more vulnerable, and that is a consequence of austerity going back many years now.
Yeah, of course. On that, I just feel it's one of these things I don't know. I appreciate that obviously we're not the government, but it feels like maybe there was a bit of a desensitization to this sort of new virus. I know that I'm just speaking to a lot of people. People are just like, oh, well, we had it with bird flu, swine flu,
SARS,
Ebola, SARS, Zika virus. There always seems to be something. And I think people, and I appreciate, I think maybe even myself just thought of seeing what was going on in China and just you kind of.
Well, to be honest, I was the same. And I think even people that, lots of people that are in the industry were having those same conversations, so I don't think anybody was immune, if you excuse the pun, to that completely. I did read something to say though that the frequency of emergence of new coronaviruses, SARS, MERS, and this one is really fast in evolutionary terms. So it's not unreasonable to expect more of these things to come.
Okay, which is actually follows on to a question that was from Robert O'Brien, which is, do we know if coronavirus will be like flu and it will change every year? I think you kind of have answered that a coronavirus is a family. I don't know if you.
Yes, that's right,
if that's right. Yeah, so it's like a family. I think I heard somewhere. Again, I don't want to just do. I think I heard somewhere, but that is like the cold is a coronavirus. I'm not sure because it's about the structure of the cell. I don't know, but do we know if coronavirus will be like flu and that will change at all?
From what I've seen, the reason that the flu virus changes so much, it has a great genetic variation from year to year. So the amount of genetic variation seen in this COVID-19 virus has been quite low, is what I've read. So the first indications are that that's not the case.
Okay. That's good to hear. Another question, which I think if we sort of maybe just sort of backtrack a little bit and go back to the lockdown, I just wanted to, we had quite a good segue into that, when we said different strains of coronavirus. I just wanted to get that one in to make it look quite professional. So we're going to have to backtrack, unfortunately. But this is from Brian Creese. He said, what do you think of the exit criteria should be? What do we need to see before the lockdown is lifted? And I know that obviously the Labour Party and Keir Starmer's been very hot on this topic, trying to make sure that we get some sort of exit strategy published at some point. What are your personal thoughts? I think you have touched on this, maybe, that normality won't be able to resume until, full normality won't be able to resume until there is a viable vaccine. But what about a lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I don't know the answer to that question. But I think I'm probably in good company with that. Yeah. So I guess what we can say is if we reduce the social distancing measures without doing anything, then logically the rates of infection will increase, unless there has been a lot of natural immunity arising in the population. And I read that the levels of infection are the number of people that have actually been exposed to the virus are still quite low, less than 10%. So that's not going to be the situation. So it's as I don't know the answer to the question, but there's going to have to be some combination of measures that don't lead to a big upsurge in the number of cases. Yeah. It's a bit like somebody I think in the news mentioned Dunkirk. We're in the process of weathering the initial onslaught at the moment, and what we can do in the meantime is build up our ability to resist in whatever ways we can. So we can build Nightingale hospitals and have more ICU capacity. We can make sure that we've got enough ventilators. So the technology that we've got available now can be built up so that there's a bit more ability, but that's not very much consolation if you're the person that ends up in that ICU unit.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this has changed at all, or their strategy has changed in this sense, but from my memory, was one of the main reasons were basically there was such a change of heart to basically go into lockdown from the government was models from Imperial College London, and they just saw that it was going to essentially just cripple the NHS. So I don't know if they're just trying to it's more about managing the strain on the National Health Service.
No, I think that's right. So yeah. Obviously, if you've got a severe respiratory illness, then you need certain treatment capabilities, and if you have more people with that illness than you have those ICU units or ventilators, then obviously people are going to die in those situations. So you're trying to match the make sure you've got more capacity to treat the people than people are coming in with those symptoms.
Okay, I got another question from a familiar name. It's Nick Palmer, who we had on last week to talk about the Waverley Borough Council response. To those who haven't seen it, you can go back onto the Facebook page. You can scroll down a little bit and you can see the conversation we had then. And it's also on YouTube. If you search for Nick Palmer, South West Surrey Labour, you'll be able to find it. But Nick's question was, with the huge worldwide effort by hundreds of companies, what's the most helpful thing that governments can do to get effective products into use? So that is something I was kind of interested in, actually. To hear what we can do.
I guess it's not really a technical question. I think it's there's probably two things that spring to mind. The first thing is not to go into competition with each other to get hold of the vaccines. So we've seen some instances there was a case at the peak of the Italian crisis. The Americans sent a military plane to ship testing kits to the US. That's the sort of behaviour we don't want. You know, we do need global solidarity, and for all the for cooperation to see that the vaccines as they come on stream are distributed in a reasonably equitable way. I think another one would be, and this is where the UK could be particularly strong, is making clinical trials easier to carry out. So the NHS, because of its structure, is particularly good at being able to get large numbers of people available for clinical trials without perhaps some of the legal hurdles that you have in other countries. So making sure that people can do clinical trials, and that maybe some of the legal barriers to that might have to be lowered in these circumstances. Companies can operate you know, without risk of litigation. That could be useful. So I think yeah, making sure we don't have that sort of fight over the materials and resources, easing clinical trials, and probably also looking at doing something around intellectual property rights, so that you know, these high-tech companies are investing, you know, an awful lot of resources and money into this, and most of them are doing it with no knowledge of you know, how they're going to fund that in the long term. Okay, international drug companies are not usually a sector that people have a lot of sympathy for, but it's probably helpful to have some kind of agreement on the intellectual property. That might just be that it's shared globally. So people have been doing with that sort of thing already with, for instance, the design of ventilators. People have been making their IP, their intellectual property, available to others.
Okay. Yeah, I can see a lot of you hear in instances, yeah, of open source sort of designs and things like that, isn't it? Yeah, that was something that I was thinking about when you were saying about these big you know, pharmaceutical companies basically coming together. And I feel like in normal times that would be looked at with an eye of suspicion by competition regulators. But is it just, I don't know if that's something that's necessarily legislated for. Is it just something that these competition regulators are just not going to look at now because it's just not in everyone's interests? Obviously in old, sorry, go on, Adrian.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the idea that someone is going to start an antitrust sort of suit against, that's the thing that's
unlikely. Yeah, that's exactly the thing that I think it's kind of strange that you know, just sort of going to the side a little bit, that we've talked about. I think we've heard a lot about this massive, essentially, stimulus package from the government to try and keep people's money coming into households and things like that, and saying that that's basically some kind of you know, our kind of values, our Labour values. But actually, you can also see in the background that the government has also sort of relaxed some red tape that's around corporations, and you can definitely imagine that it's been extended to pharmaceutical companies at this time, because it's just in no one's interest, is it really? Like you said, no one wants to do an antitrust petition or anything like that at this point. I think I am mindful of time. We've been going on quite a while, actually. I was expecting us to only be about half an hour, but had quite a lot of good questions. So we'll do, I think we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 left, Adrian, if that's okay. And then I think maybe we'll call it there. So I would thank everyone for putting questions in. It's been great, actually. Really good to get a nice little discussion. But this one is from Linda McDermott. Linda McDermott says, my son lives in Hong Kong and he's adamant that wearing a mask is key to keeping numbers low. Any comment? At least I personally, I think way before this, I would have. I'm going to qualify this now, and this is the worst thing to do, isn't it? But I'm not a scientist. But it feels. I always thought before that it wasn't effective, but now I've sort of like been swapping my position every now and then when you see what is happening in Germany, where they're saying that you can only go on public transport with a face mask, and things like in America where you can only go out. I don't know if you have any sort of scientific knowledge on this at all, or what you think.
I've read a couple of things, and I to be honest, I'm not clear on what the evidence is pointing to. So my I guess the right response is to follow the data, and we should be guided by the data. So one of the things that's not clear, for instance, is that the severity of illness depends on the viral load. So that's if you do get into contact with the virus, is how much you get in contact with at the time, and there's quite a lot of stuff around in terms of the method of transmission, and whether a mask will be effective or not. So I don't have a firm view on this one at the moment. So
yeah, it's funny. I just like I said, I'm not a scientist, so I just have to go by what Public Health England is saying. I think at the moment they're basically saying that they're ineffective in a non-surgical environment.
I think, and Public Health England are a pretty respectable, outfit, and if that's what their data is saying, then I would tend to follow it.
Yeah, because I think there's all sorts. It's not necessarily just the it's not necessarily just the actual physiology or the science behind actually wearing the mask. It's what it does socially, like lure you into a full sense of security, I think. And I've seen people, I've seen people when queuing up, they've got gloves on and things like that, and it's like, oh, that's good. And then they've got their hands on the trolley, and then they just go like that, and it's like, well, that's just completely useless, But so it's things like that.
Yeah.
Which to me it feels like that. Anyway, I got another question actually from Linda McDermott, which I know we've touched on briefly, but about spending, NHS spending. Should we campaign for ring-fence taxes for NHS? So I think we'll definitely qualify that we're probably speaking with certainly our Labour hats on here. I think I know what your answers could be there.
I think it's I think yes is the answer personally. That's just my personal opinion. I think the fact that we go into this crisis with the lowest contribution to GDP, of the G7, I think, is that correct? It's certainly one of the lowest, if it's not the lowest. And you see that reflected in the number of ICU units, possibly lack of lab capacity. Then I think it would be very, very well supported, and I would like to see this kind of a public outpouring of support for the NHS turned into something which will be useful for the NHS and the people that work in it, in years to come. Yeah,
I know that some political parties have advocated, raising everybody's income tax. I think the Liberal Democrats used to have that policy where it was raise everybody's income tax, no matter how much you earn, by a penny, to go straight into the NHS. And I think that what they try to do there is try and foster a sense that you're contributing into something. But in reality, my personal feeling, at least on this, is that that certainly years of austerity have seemed to have left the NHS on the back foot in this. And like you say, that's just like an inkling. But when you hear that, as you said, our ICU capacity was low and our spending per capita is low in comparison to other G7 countries, that's sort of quite striking to me.
I add that you have to consider social care in that budget as well, though, because if you rob social care, you just put more load onto the NHS.
Sheila Ashworth asked, at the start of this, WHO recommended everyone to test, and of course trace. Did we stop because of the lack of resources, or that it wasn't taken seriously? I know we've touched on this, but what are your thoughts? Was it taken seriously at all?
I can't say that I've got any more expertise in answering this question than anybody else, but I do think it was a lack of resources that interfered with our ability to do that. So our strategy at the start was very similar to everybody else's, in that there was an attempt to track and trace people that were seen to be infected, but anybody travelling through an airport, a couple of months ago would have seen there was very little going on. So I suspect that lack of resources was a key issue, but also I think, as we mentioned earlier, there was a bit of confusion about strategy in the UK, which seemed to be different to everybody else's strategy.
Definitely. Yeah, you were definitely right about that, about the airports. Something I have, an anecdote that I've given to people, but haven't actually done very publicly, is that just a week or two before lockdown, I was in Finland, and I got the ferry over to Estonia. And when I got to port in Tallinn, there were people handing out leaflets in English, Russian, and Finnish. English, Russian, and Estonian. Sorry. Basically, just quite a basic information on coronavirus and spreading and transmission of it. And then when I flew back from Estonia to Gatwick, there was nothing, no information anywhere, no, tests. You see these images of people doing thermometer tests and things like that, and there was nothing. And then a week or so later, we had Boris Johnson telling people that if they can work from home, they should. So yeah, it does feel like that. It does feel like maybe they would sort of.
You get the impression that the British government's response was something on the back foot, as it were, not really leading.
Yeah, like we've all heard, they saw that. It sounds like they saw that model from Imperial, and then suddenly realised the scale of the issue at hand. I'm gonna sneak one more question in, because after. So I'm going to do two more, essentially, because I feel quite generous today. I'm sorry. So this is another one from Robert over in. Unless the British public are extraordinarily forgiving, Keir Starmer will be the next Prime Minister. Do Labour have any big brains working on economic strategies to weather the financial storms which are apparently heading our way? Where's Gordon? I'm sorry, Robert. I'm going to hide that question because it's a big question, and it's hiding our faces a little bit there. But so again, back with our sort of Labour hats on, what do we think of that? Do we think there's anybody really coming on with an economic strategy at the moment? At least my personal view is that we're taking quite, at least the party or the PLP are taking quite a back, just sort of sitting back a little bit to try and work out what the political weather is going to be like at the end of this, because they're not sure if there's going to be a massive appetite for what they would like, or if they're going to have to sort of go along the consensus at the moment. I'm not sure what you think of that.
Well, I think political tactics aside, one thing that you could say is the myth that there's something sacrosanct and independent called the market, and that governments have no ability to intervene, has once again been shown for the myth that it is. So we've seen the biggest, effectively, sort of massive increase in government spending, commitments, and virtual nationalisation in response to the crisis, which is a good thing, but it does kind of undermine a lot of conservative ideology in terms of the market. So whoever's going to be looking at those big economic questions will be doing it from the basis of a hopefully a new understanding by the public of what can and can't be done. Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that. I think only a few months before we heard that we're essentially we were hearing that the Labour's financial plans were unstable and reckless, and now we've seen that in the light of crisis, sometimes you just need to the state just needs to take a hand to try and ensure the welfare of its citizens.
my feeling, or at least my thought is that what we see now is if we have another economic crisis in 10 years time, are people really going to be able to like sit back and just, when they just lose their jobs, are they just going to sit back and take it? I just don't think they will, because they'll be like, well, you know, I had 80% of my salary paid, or, you know, by the government. And I think that's going to take quite a while to get used to, or people to lose.
Yeah. It's like, you know, if the homeless can be taken in and looked after, why couldn't they, you know, before the crisis?
Yeah. I think Tony Benn actually once said, you know, if you can find money to wage war, you can find money to help people. And we did touch on that briefly last week, that, you know, after the created the NHS, the Beveridge Report, the foundations of the welfare state after the Second World War. You know, that goes to show that in times of crisis, we do all come together and do things that the Labour Party stand for, you know, through common endeavour, trying to get through crises and help, you know, the many, not the few. In terms of a big sort of heavyweight to help with the economic strategy, I know that obviously we've got a new shadow chancellor in Annalisa Dodds, I hope I'm saying that properly, who is a Labour South East MP. So hopefully we're seeing quite a lot of her on the news and talking about the sort of economic response, but hopefully she can grow into that role and she'll be a really good force to be reckoned with. So I did say last question. This is going to be the last question because it's from Natasha Fletcher, who is a climate emergency coordinator for Southwest Surrey. So it's good to hear from her. So she said there was an article today in the Guardian stating that we're not using up all our capability for testing yet. Not enough swabs are being sent due to a lack of political will. Is contact tracing and testing the most effective exit strategy from lockdown until a vaccination is found, and how do we improve this? Sorry, Natasha, I'm going to have to hide your comment again, but just because it's so big. But basically, is contact tracing and testing the most effective strategy?
Thanks, Natasha. I'm not sure how testing can be applied now, given the you know, widespread spread of the virus. So contact tracing, I think, was a strategy when the numbers of infections are quite low. But you're now in the situation where very large numbers of people could have come into contact. So as we were talking about earlier, I do think that testing is a key part of the exit strategy, but I don't know exactly how that would be best applied. But I think what's fair to say is the more testing capacity you've got, the more options you've got to, you know, to get people back to work and back out of their homes. Yeah,
I think that's right. I think, yeah, like you said, it gives you just more options. So we'll just have to wait and see how we do. I'm going to be interested to see if they're going to meet their 100,000 target by the end of the month. So we're halfway through now, so we've got a while yet. So let's wait and see. I think that was going to be the end of the questions, actually, Adrian. Okay. Just some quick, there are a couple of comments that I just think would be quite handy to show. Linda McDermott, in terms of the face mask, it just feels safer having face masks, apart from that it steams up your glasses. I don't have that problem.
I think you know, it's a personal choice, and you know, if it makes you feel safer, then it's not going to do any harm.
Yeah, I've broadly looked at that. Yeah, like, I agree. If it comes down to it, if you feel safer, as long as you know, make sure you don't lure yourself into a false sense of security. And something we have missed, actually, it's 8 o'clock on Thursday, so we've actually, as Sheila said, I didn't notice this, but we should go outside to clap because we have a break. So I'm really sorry, Sheila, we didn't. Yeah. But I think we can use this opportunity, obviously, just to actually just do a bit more than clapping, actually say thank you to everybody that's working at the moment, all these key workers. Like you said, it's this huge effort from everybody. I think we see, you know, it's not just people who have the idea that key workers is literally just the nurses and the doctors who obviously who are certainly on the front line and facing the worst of this. but it's also, like you said, there's people working, there's researchers that are working on this, as you've sort of highlighted. So actually speaking to you, you've managed to sort of highlight that there is a lot more going on behind the scenes. People are still pretty key to fight this, aren't they?
Yeah, there's a lot of people involved.
Yeah, and it just, like you said, supply chains and everything like that. That's when you start looking back at where it all starts, it's quite goes to show how important everyone really is at this stage. So sorry that we've missed
social solidarity.
Yeah, exactly. So sorry that we've missed that. I generally didn't think that we'd go on for this long. So we've had a really interesting discussion. So I think that's why we've missed it. So as we said, we obviously thank everybody that's working really hard. I'll have to say, thank you to one of my friends, Rachel, who's a nurse in the NHS, and speaking to her at the moment, she's been sort of requisitioned away from her usual place of work to go back onto a ward. So she's working quite hard and retelling stories about PPE and things like that are quite sobering, really. So yeah. Is there anything else you just want to add, Adrian, before we let you go?
No. Hopefully that was of some interest, and just wish everybody the best of health, and look after yourselves. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Adrian. I'm going to let you go, and then I'm going to run through a couple more things, because I've got some little websites and things that might be helpful to people. So thank you very much, Adrian. It's been really informative. I learned a lot, and knowing about those 3 pillars, I think really actually helps all of us, because it helps us focus on what the government needs to be doing, and sort of focus our minds on what we should be holding them to account for, really. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Adrian. So thanks to Adrian. That was really, really helpful. I feel like I learned so much. I'm, as mentioned, not a scientist at all. So to actually have an engineer come on and explain how industry is trying to tackle this problem and the scale of the issue at hand. Hearing that the vaccines are going to be the world record for vaccine production is 5 years, and we really need to get one before then. It's quite something. So I did run through a couple of things last time, just for some basic information on coronavirus. So if you're actually in the South West Surrey constituency, there's a good chance you're probably in Waverley. You're in the Waverley Borough Council area. So if you've got any queries on coronavirus, you can obviously look at waverley.gov.uk. That's really, really helpful, especially if you are unable to pay council tax or unable to pay your Waverley Borough Council rent. And sort of in the devolved sense, town councils as well have got information. So for Godalming, you can go to godalming-tc.gov.uk. If you're in Farnham, you can go farnham.gov.uk. And for Haslemere, haslemeretc.org. So there's some information. And there's a coronavirus helpline, which is 0300 200 1008. That's 0300 200 1008. A lot of thanks in the comment section, so I really appreciate that. Yeah, I really appreciate everyone that actually putting comments in. It was really, really helpful. It was great to have some questions that I couldn't really think of on the spot. So thank you everyone for your questions. As mentioned, this will be up on YouTube afterwards. So if you want to ever revisit and see what we said, then you can do that. And we'll try to share that out by email as well on YouTube. So maybe in a day or so, if you go on YouTube and search for South West Surrey Labour Party, you'll be able to find the YouTube channel there. And if you click on that, you can have a look through, and you can even find last week's conversation, if you did miss it, with Nick Palmer, who is the leader of the Labour group in Waverley Borough Council. So I'm going to leave it there. And as Linda's pointed out, don't forget that Cranley is in Waverley. Yes, sorry, I always do. So don't forget Cranley is in Waverley as well. So brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate everyone's comments, thoughts, questions. It's been great. So I'm going to leave it there. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.